Thank you all for being here this morning. Since taking office, the Biden administration has been on a regulatory blitz. And what I mean by that is if you compare it to the Obama administration, where you saw about $300 billion of increased costs resulting from more regulations, under the Biden administration, we've seen about a 1.3, almost a $1.4 trillion increase in the regulatory burden put on businesses. Having been in business, started a few businesses myself, that could only increase the cost of being in business. Now you compare that with the total cost of the Trump administration, that was a little bit over $30 billion. So $30 billion with the Trump administration, $300 billion with the Obama administration, and over 1.3, nearly $1.4 trillion of added regulatory cost. Dr. Schrager, do you agree that the breakneck speed of new regulations finalized by this administration has contributed to inflation?
Yeah, it certainly has contributed. As I said, there's a lot of factors going on, but certainly when you make it more expensive for businesses to produce, spend more time on paperwork, especially a huge part of inflation consumers are having problems with is the cost of housing. And certainly a lot of regulation, and particularly a lot of environmental regulations that make it more expensive to build housing, is making that more expensive. And I think we're seeing in a lot of surveys that, as I said, the cost of housing is really number one for a lot of consumers. So I think deregulation it wouldn't solve all of the inflation problems, but it would certainly help.
Let me just stay on that subject because I hadn't thought about what you just said as it relates to housing. Certainly seen the housing costs go up without question. I served some time in local government where we improved and increased the building requirements in Charleston County. If you think about the regulatory burden that comes from a municipality or a county, and then you add that on top of the state, and on top of that is the federal government, you see this regulatory burden that is, in many ways for small businesses, frankly oppressive. I also think that an oppressive regulatory environment actually reduces competition and only benefits the players who are already in that space, and is more likely to create a monopoly in that space. That is not good for consumers. Thoughts?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And in fact, we see this a lot in Europe, who have a lot more regulatory burden, particularly around technology, which we're talking about here, and how firms use data. And this was intended, as I said, to increase competition, but actually had the opposite effect, because complying with all of these regulations have actually made technological entrepreneurship much harder there.
There's no doubt when you see our largest technological firms saying, please regulate me, because it closes the door of competition, it kind of answers the question itself. A different question for you. I won't say this very well, but I'll do my best. From my perspective, watching the legislation leave Washington and impact the country, whether it's the first bill signed into law, the $1.9 trillion legislation, that artificial stimulation where you're pouring new resources or cash into our economy, actually artificial stimulation called money from the government, increases the demand without increasing the supply. And so if you increase the demand without increasing the supply, and you add on top of that the snarl from a transportation perspective that we saw in 21 and 22, it's harder to get your supplies. So it only increases the demand because you have fewer supply and you have more money in the market, which also increases the supply. The ultimate outcome of that is less supply, larger demand, and no real ability to see when your products are going to get there. That is very hard for businesses to manage, and it only leads to a more challenging environment.
Yeah, exactly. I think even economists who associate themselves as Democrats would have been saying that at least 3 to 4 percentage points of the initial inflation was due to stimulative fiscal policy, which has definitely sort of added to demand. And, it's important to argue we still have very stimulative fiscal policy, despite the fact we're in a high inflation environment, which makes the Fed's job a lot harder.
Great. I only have about 20 seconds left. You said, I think, during your opening comments that the corporate profits peaked in 2021? 22. I think that's actually relevant as well as we think about the greed of our corporations. And frankly, I'm not going to sit here and defend any of them, but they have the ability and responsibility of defending themselves. But as a kid who grew up in poverty, the one thing I can tell you is that the price that we're seeing at the pump and the lack of the ability for a single mother to navigate gas prices, energy prices, and food prices, when we see a glut of resources coming into the marketplace, and for 52 consecutive paychecks, inflation outpaces her wage increases. That's a devastation. That's not a problem, but a crisis.